famous pediatric endocrinologist from UCSF. Is he somebody you've worked with and know pretty well?
I don't know him super well. We met at the Ancestral Health Symposium last year, and so I don't know him super well. Not like Gary Tobbs or some other folks, but yeah.
We think he does a beautiful job with his video that's gone viral on YouTube, The Bitter Truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have some resources here in town that Tammy introduced me to, Dr. Michael Lucia, who makes your point exactly. When people are sleep deprived, they want carbs. And I was interested to see just recently a small study out of Mayo. Sleep deprived people eat extra calories and most of it's carbs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's your point exactly.
Yeah, and there was a CBS News piece that Dr. Lustig was in from the Ancestral Health Symposium from last year, and it was a great little snippet, but he said a paleo diet would reverse type 2 diabetes in less than 2 weeks. And we've known that for a long time. We have some blood work that kind of is compelling that way, but we haven't had anybody that was a completely top of the food chain researcher, academic, that was really plugged into the higher levels of the system that's come out and said that. So that was a pretty good feather in our cap for everybody pushing this kind of lower carb, more evolutionary biology oriented approach to this stuff. And it's pretty clear. I equate insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes to me is indistinguishable from a scenario of like sunburn. You have an environmental insult, which, in the case of the type 2 diabetes, too much carbohydrate. In the situation of a sunburn, you're getting too much, UV radiation. You've got genetic variability on that. Different people can tolerate various amounts of these insults, and you need to dial the exposure down to a level in which you're not causing pathology in people. And so the analogy, I think, works pretty strongly, and it's incredibly frustrating to know that one of the biggest problems that we face is this insulin-resistant obesity, type 2 diabetes, and we have a crystal clear solution to this problem. And it's not quite career suicide like it was at one time to make this recommendation of a higher protein, higher fat, lower carb diet, but it's not far off in some circles. And it's shocking because the literature is crystal clear. When we compare a metabolic ward cohort of people who are fed a high carb, low fat, isocaloric or ad libitum diet, and we see what happens to them metabolically, and then we do the same thing with a low carb intervention. This low carb intervention reverses all of the metabolic parameters associated with insulin resistance. The high carb, low fat intervention does not. We have all kinds of problems with hunger and recidivism and adherence in the high carb, low fat crowd. We have none of those problems in the low carb camp. And the literature is clear on this, and it's not like we need to do more of it. We've done quite a bit, and under gold standard metabolic ward crossover, really gold standard type stuff. And you just showed me a piece in JAMA where they were talking about, I think it's over here, where I think obesity is an overconsumption of calories. We don't know why that is. It's hard to get people to not overeat. Woe is me, what are we going to do? And it's clear, it's so clear that this person has not read any of the low-carb literature at all.
I think Robb is going to get along fabulously with Dr. Peter Attia, whose blog, The War on Insulin, makes exactly that point. You and Peter are going to be close friends.
Robb, could you just touch on calories not being the same? And
sure, yeah, and this is one of the fun ones that comes out of academia is, we focus on calories as the driver. And I mean, at the end of the day, obviously, like thermodynamics do come in, and like if you want to lose some weight, you do need to eat fewer calories and stuff like that. But then there's this reality that carbohydrates have a completely different effect on the brain than protein or fat does. Protein and fat are very satiating. They release cholecystokinin, they release peptide YY, all of these signals that basically tell the brain, I'm full, I'm good. Whereas carbohydrate particularly in the insulin-resistant individual, it does quite the opposite. It will actually dysregulate the normal neuroregulation of appetite. And so you have individuals that have a year of stored calories on their body. If the neuroregulation of appetite was working, how could they possibly be hungry? But yet they are hungry every day, every moment, all the time, and continue to eat themselves into oblivion. And so there's obviously some broken machinery there, and it's very clear in the literature that protein and fat are very satiating. It's quite difficult to overeat on protein and fat. I've had some clients that can do it, and the interesting thing is that these individuals, one guy that I'm thinking of in particular, 5'9", over 400 pounds when we started working with him, and he had so effectively over the course of years managed to eat beyond what his satiety mechanisms were sending to him. We don't have people weigh and measure their food. We just kind of give them some broad brush strokes, and this guy was not really losing weight. And I was kind of like, okay, well, start journaling what you're eating. And I saw he had an afternoon snack, and it said almonds. And I was like, how many almonds are you eating? And he said, the Costco container of almonds? It's 3,500 calories in a sitting that this guy was eating. And he was still losing weight, but it just wasn't as fast as what we would have expected it to be. And so over the course of time, we actually got the guy down around 225 eventually. But man, it was a battle. I mean, it was just a battle because this guy in particular had so broken, and maybe there's genetic factors there or whatever, but his neuroregulation of appetite, his ability to know what he was putting down his mouth, was a reasonable amount, was broken. It's like if you were filling up your car and the gas pump didn't know when the car was full, it would just go and go and go.
You talked about diet affecting our cravings or our sense of being full, but there's some pretty compelling evidence out there that different ratios of carbohydrates and fats and protein with the same caloric value can affect the same person very, very differently. And the person that had a 70 to 80% carbohydrate intake actually was gaining weight on that 2,000 calories.
Right.
And then when you switch them and put them on a higher protein, fat diet, and lower carbohydrate diet, even when the caloric intake was the same, they lost weight. Talk to me about that.
You're really good lead on that. Protein has this thermic effect. And so when it goes through the metabolic machinery, even though we say a gram of protein is 4 calories, a gram of carbs is 4 calories, a gram of fat is 4 calories, when it actually burns through the metabolic machinery, protein has this high thermic effect. It makes us radiate more heat. And so when we're trying to think about our bodies as a bomb calorimeter, it doesn't really work quite the same way. So if we divvy up this 2,000 calories of protein, carbs, fat in different ratios, there's a not insignificant difference if you're eating a lot more protein versus less protein. Like even if you dig around in some of the bodybuilding websites, if you eat a high protein diet relative to a moderate protein diet, they will recommend more calories overall because they know that that protein has a high thermic effect. Your body just burns more calories that just turns into waste heat out in the environment. So it doesn't register the same way. It's not just throwing logs on a fire. These things flow through different metabolic pathways and turn different genes on and off, release different hormones, and they register very, very differently. Yeah.
What about someone who has IR, insulin resistance, and the enzyme is affected by carbohydrates and the ability to store more calories as fat? Do you think that that's a factor with a high carbohydrate diet?
If you're already insulin resistant, then that tendency of just having elevated insulin levels is kind of there. And so you definitely have a tendency to kind of shuttle or partition nutrients into fat. And then there's another flip side of that. When we are insulin resistant, we were talking a little bit about blood glucose swings. If you're insulin resistant, if you dip into a low blood sugar stage, which you will do unless you're constantly eating, then you're going to release cortisol. When you release that cortisol, you're going to release glucose out of the liver, but you also break down protein. You have gluconeogenesis. And this is where insulin resistance type 2 diabetes is a wasting disease. So not only do we have an issue of the way that you partition nutrients, do carbohydrates go into fat? Yeah, they do. We have, to me, almost an even more cryptic side which the muscle mass goes away. Insulin resistance is a wasting disease. And when the wheels really fall off the wagon, that's when that gets very, very severe. And this is bad on a lot of levels, but one of them is just that where do we want to store carbohydrate when we do have carbohydrate circling? In muscles. Yeah. And so if you have a wasting disease where you took an individual that was walking around with 130 pounds of muscle and now they've got 98 pounds of muscle, the glucose sink, the place that we could store glucose, is now dramatically reduced. The GLUT4 transporters in the muscles are not working properly, so you have fewer places to put it, it's harder to get it in, and then we've primed the pump on the adipose side to stick it into fat. Yeah. And if it happens to be highly, highly refined carbohydrates, then we tend to just pump it right out of the hepatic portal vein. It dumps into the omentum. The omentum just gobbles that stuff up, and that's like the most metabolically nasty fat to carry in the body. It's the most pro-inflammatory. It's loaded with macrophages and all of those innate immune cells, which is where we start getting the immune side of this thing rolling in with the metabolic derangement. You start growing that fat mass and the immune cells go bananas. And there's, I won't go down that path, but there's a lot of stuff that seems to indicate this is very a holdover of long-term adaptation to parasitic infections.